Hotter than a Phoenix sidewalk in August, it's NFL Fantasy Live presented by EA Sports Madden NFL 21. I am Marcus Grant, letterboxed next to Cynthia Freeland and Adam Rank. Kimmy Checks will join us in just a bit. And folks, we had another episode of Hard Knocks last night, and I am digging the Tyrod Taylor hair and beard combination. And so, Cynthia, I just wanted to ask you, who wore it better, Tyrod or Childish Gambino in the This Is America video?
That's a really easy question because it is Tyrod all day long. He's got great style, and he's had great style like since the Buffalo days. And I think it might be hard to have good style in Buffalo, but if you can pull it off in Buffalo and in Cleveland and in LA, you're doing something right.
Yeah, I really believe I'm going to have to move Tyrod up my rankings just for that look that we saw last night.
Absolutely. I feel like the Tyrod drum beats are getting louder. He should get that unofficial Hard Knocks fantasy football bump. Hey, and don't forget, there is still plenty of time to get your very own fantasy league started for 2020. You can sign up today at NFL.com/fantasy and get all the advantages of playing the official fantasy game of the NFL. All right, we will turn our attention to Air Rankings presented by FedEx. Today, we're splitting up the quarterbacks into draft tiers. Cynthia, who is in tier 1 for you? And how early is potentially too early to try and draft those players?
There are only two guys in tier 1, and it is no shocker anywhere, any place, anytime. If you know anything about fantasy, it's Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes. You can fight over who's number 1 and number 2. And we've done that on this program, actually. But ultimately, those two are the only two that are really reliably capable of getting you like those really, 400-ish points. So ultimately, those are the only two guys with the right formula for that kind of success. I'd say it's painful, but you could go round 4, maybe even round 5 if you got lucky. I don't think they're going to last much longer than that in most leagues.
Yeah, well, I'm looking at the tier 2 guys, and these are guys generally available somewhere between round 5 through 7. It's a bigger group. Dak Prescott, Russell Wilson, Deshaun Watson, Kyler Murray, Josh Allen, kind of on the fringe of that second tier. And I like them because generally they are guys you can set it and forget it. You have them in your lineup each and every week. They'll give you solid passing production. They've got a pretty solid floor also when it comes to their rushing ability. And so you can get those, as we say, those hidden yards, those cheat code points from this group of quarterbacks in tier 2.
You know what? I'm still the person who shops at the discount store and then waits for the clearance sale. So I'll look at the tier 3 guys. And a guy like Carson Wentz, who's averaged 2 touchdown passes per game since 2017, despite having a host of injuries at the wide receiver position. We saw Aaron Rodgers there, that even though he was coming off one of his worst seasons of his career fantasy-wise, could be a huge value this year. Matt Ryan, one of the most consistent quarterbacks in fantasy football, a top 2 fantasy quarterback in 2 of his last 4 seasons. And of course, the 2 elder statesmen, you see Drew Brees right there. Solid player, top 6 fantasy quarterbacks in 11 of his last 14. And of course, Tom Brady, who's had just 1 season with 30 touchdown passes in his last 4, but has a brand new situation with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
Look, you like discounts, clearance. I'm going for the super clearance rack. The tier 4 guys that you can get late round if you're not going to get any of those guys that we mentioned. I really like Baker Mayfield and this remade Kevin Stefanski offense. If you look at what he did the second half of the season, starting in weeks 9 through 17, he was having, 16 passing touchdowns? And that's a pretty good number for you for fantasy purposes. And then when you look at Matthew Stafford, he just had almost 21 fantasy points per game last season, which ranked 4th amongst quarterbacks. So really, Matthew Stafford, always underrated.
Yeah, and I love both of those choices right there as well. I would also advise people to check out Cam Newton playing with Josh McDaniels, his first opportunity to run the RPO since Tim Tebow was his quarterback in Denver. So I'm taking a couple of chances on him in leagues.
And despite a myriad of circular stories, Cam Newton looks like he will for sure be the starter there in New England. It's positional breakdown time, and we are focusing on the wide receivers today. Here are the top 10 wideouts in terms of average draft position so far this season. You see Michael Thomas, of course, there at number 1, Julio at 5. Chris Godwin was the wide receiver 2. He's coming off the board at wide receiver 6, which seems like a little bit of haterade to me. And then Cooper Kupp rounding out the top 10. We've given you our thoughts on most of these guys already, so we'll start with our favorite second-tier wide receivers, maybe some guys that are just outside the top 10. We welcome in Kimmy Checks joining us. And so, Kimmy, let's start with you. Who would you target as your wide receiver 2 this year?
Now, I am kind of all fired up this season and getting the hype train rolling for scary Terry McLaurin out of the Washington football team. Now, he had a stud breakout season last year as a rookie in 2019 with the most fantasy points per game out of all rookie wide receivers. Now, on top of that, he also led the Washington football team in targets, receptions, receiving yards, and touchdowns. Now, he is going to continue to be Dwayne Haskins' #1 passing game option receiver, and this is a guy that I think people should look to target in their fantasy drafts. Now, I'm a millennial who lives on social media, so I have been all over Twitter and seen the fire videos of the connections between Dwayne Haskins and Terry McLaurin, so I'm all in and think he is a second-round receiver that people should look to target.
He is everyone's favorite sleeper receiver, I guess breakout receiver this year, if you will. I'm looking at Tyler Lockett there, going from Washington, D.C. up to Seattle, Washington. And Lockett was a guy that a lot of people expected to have a huge season last year. And for the most part, he did. But I think he's being hurt by remembering a bad stretch he had sort of late in the season. He was injured for about a month and really saw his production fall off. But when he was healthy, had about 25% of the target share, was 18th among all players in air yards last year. I don't expect that to change much in what is pretty much a narrowly focused passing game there with the Seahawks.
You know what, Marcus? I know that you had that board up and Mike Evans was the 7th receiver, but I did want to circle back to that and make a point of this because I really do believe, and you were talking about the haterade for Chris Godwin, I believe that people aren't giving enough respect to Mike Evans. And speaking of Chris Godwin, I had an opportunity to talk with him on Saturday, and he was raving about the connection that Mike Evans has had with Tom Brady thus far in training camp. And we know all the things about Mike Evans. He led the NFL in, air yards last year. He is one of 2 receivers along with Randy Moss to have 1,000 receiving yards in each of his first 2 years. But I really do believe the touchdown connection is going to be huge with him and Tom Brady. I know they have Rob Gronkowski, but I really do believe that Mike Evans is going to be the Rob Gronkowski of this offense, at least when they get near the goal line.
He has been the picture of consistency among fantasy wide receivers going back to 2016. All right, Kimmy, who are some under-the-radar wideouts you think could break out in 2020?
So under the radar guy that I'm looking to target this season is Kenny Stills. As we all know, DeAndre Hopkins is no longer a Houston Texans, which leaves 150 receptions that he had last season up for grabs. And Kenny Stills is looking to get a little piece of that pie. Now, Stills joined the Houston Texans at the beginning of last season after being traded from Miami. And in the last 4 games of the season, he scored 3 touchdowns. What does this mean? This means that he is building more of a strong rapport with Deshaun Watson. Now, Stills is still second in the depth chart behind guys like Will Fuller, Brandon Cooks, and Randall Cobb, but I do think he is a good sleeper that people should target because of the injury history with those other receivers. So I'm all in on Kenny Stills and think that with DeAndre Hopkins being out, there is plenty of opportunity for him to step in.
I'm staying in the Lone Star State, and I have been pounding the table all offseason for Michael Gallup. I mean, everybody talks about Amari Cooper. Everybody is high on CeeDee Lamb, understandably. But let's remember that last year, Gallup nearly matched Cooper in most statistical categories and really offered a much safer week-to-week floor than Cooper did. There's plenty of targets to go around in this Dallas offense. And according to reports, he is sort of the receiver 1A or 1B, depending on how you look at it in that passing game. I think this is a year that he could ascend, maybe even challenge or pass Amari Cooper in terms of their fantasy production down there in Dallas.
I'm going to stay in the NFC East. I'll go with Darius Slayton, a receiver who came on at the end of last season, 5 receiving touchdowns in weeks 10 through 17, and that was tied for the highest total amongst wide receivers. He also led the Giants with 53 targets during that time. And I look at this offense being directed by second-year quarterback Daniel Jones, new offensive coordinator Jason Garrett, and with a defense that could give up a lot of points this season, it leads me to believe that Darius Slayton could be on the cusp of a breakout in 2020.
We talked a lot about the other rookie there, Daniel Jones in New York, but Darius Slayton put together a pretty nice season, especially late in the year. Kimmy, finally, who are the receivers that maybe are going a little bit too early in drafts right now?
So, a guy that I'm a little bit weary about, and this is not at all because of his performance and what I think he's capable of, but instead because of the offense that he joined, is Stefon Diggs. Now, the Buffalo Bills are not that great of a passing team because of Josh Allen, and I think people should stay away from Stefon Diggs if they can. Now, Josh Allen attempted less than 30 passes a game, and sadly, he ranks dead last at the quarterback position for passing accuracy, with only 51% of the ball landing in receivers' hands. Now, this is a run-first team with a strong defense, so I'm not expecting big jumps in passing attempts, which means not so good news for Stefon Diggs.
I'm looking at AJ Green here, and obviously he missed all of last year with an injury. He's dealt with some lower body injuries over the last couple of seasons. Now the big news about AJ Green is that he's running at practice. I mean, you're talking about a guy that's going off the board in the 6th round, and the best thing we have to say about him right now in mid-August is that he is running at practice. I would rather take a shot at some other guys that are still on the board at that spot, like Will Fuller, like Michael Gallup, who I mentioned earlier, than to go after a guy who's getting a little bit older, who's had some injury issues, and an offense that has some question marks.
You know, I've seen Devontae Parker go off fantasy draft boards way too early, and there's nobody who is a huger fan of Devontae Parker's breakout season finally last year than me. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to go back and just assume like everything is good to go. Like, oh, okay, like he didn't finish in what, the top 50 in 4 of his last 5 seasons, and now all of a sudden we're putting all this faith in him. So I understand. Listen, talented player, talented receiver. I love him, but I do not trust him in fantasy football.
Yeah, with Preston Williams back, he is likely to take some of those targets away from Devontae Parker. Last season, Kyler Murray finished 8th among quarterbacks in fantasy points scored, ahead of guys like Aaron Rodgers, Matt Ryan, and Tom Brady, which proves the right rookie can be a much more valuable fantasy pick than the known quantity. And so, hey, rookies, it's time to raise your game, presented by EA Sports Madden NFL 21. We're going to identify 3 rookies who you might want to draft ahead of some more maybe established veterans. Kimmy Checks, who do you have in that category?
I think you said it best. The kids, like myself, are all right. And I'm looking to draft Jonathan Taylor ahead of a veteran running back like Mark Ingram. Now, Jonathan Taylor has landed in the ideal scenario for the Indianapolis Colts. Now, they are a top 5 team in running the ball with close to 30 carries a game. If you look back to what Jonathan Taylor did at the University of Wisconsin, he had back-to-back seasons with 2,000 plus yards, as well as having the fastest 40 time out of all running backs at this last year's combine. So I think he's young, he's mobile, and he has a high ceiling, and I'm taking the bets on drafting him this season over a veteran.
I'm going to stay with the running back theme and go with DeAndre Swift, who you talk about combine 40 times. Swift lived up to his name, running a 4.48 in Indianapolis. I like him over Devin Singletary this year, in part because I feel like their roles are sort of going in opposite directions. The more we hear about Swift in Detroit, the more it looks like he's getting a bigger opportunity. Some saying he's getting an Alvin Kamara-like role. Meanwhile, as much as I love Singletary's talent, it seems like the Bills just aren't completely sold on him. They draft Zach Moss, who could end up getting a lot of that goal line work. And so I think I'm going to go with the rookie right now over the second-year guy.
I'm going to go with CeeDee Lamb, and let's say I take him over John Brown, which is actually what happened to me over the weekend. I was looking for a wide receiver, some depth at the position, and I am really fascinated by CeeDee Lamb's talent. I thought that he was the best receiver coming into this draft. I was really worried that the Packers were going to draft him. Thankfully, that did not happen. He's with the Dallas Cowboys. I understand. You talked about Michael Gallup earlier in the show, and I do agree that there's a lot of receivers on that team, and a lot of mouths to feed. But last year, Jason Witten and Randall Cobb, I'm sure you've heard me say this a million times, so let me add one more. There's 177 targets available with a brand new head coach who loves to throw the football. So I'll take a chance on CeeDee Lamb right there.
Dallas Cowboys, maybe a chance to be the first team with 3,000-yard receivers since the 2008 Arizona Cardinals. It's time for ground rankings presented by FedEx. Cynthia Freeland back with us again. And in today's ground rankings, we're looking at a few running backs in their 2019 production and comparing them to what we think could happen with them in 2020. So, Cynthia, Austin Eckler was a top 5 fantasy running back last season. And that's with Melvin Gordon hanging around in the same backfield. Now, this year, Eckler is the main man. So will he have more points or fewer points than the 309 PPR points he put up last year?
So I think it's going to be a good season, but I think 309 is too many points. Why? They're going to have to slow this offense down. You've got Tyrod Taylor. You've got a new quarterback that's being folded in. It's not entirely certain when that's going to happen. And the main point here is their defense. With all of these pieces back, Derwin James, they're healthier. Healthier defense means slower offense, means more wins. So they're going to plan for Austin Eckler to be really important and useful. But I think 309 reflects that they were in a bunch of close games. They were late and they had to go to him.
Phillip Rivers also led the NFL in pass attempts per game to running backs. Not sure if Tyrod Taylor can keep up that pace in 2020. All right, Kimmy. Chris Carson managed 233 fantasy points a year ago. Now the Seahawks have Carlos Hyde, Rashad Penny, DJ Dallas behind him. Can Chris Carson get more or fewer than 233 this year?
You know, I think the biggest question is, can Chris Carson stay healthy? Now, he fractured his hip last season in week 16, and he decided to have rehab instead of having surgery. Now, as the last 3 seasons that he has been an NFL player, he has missed 14 out of 48 games, which just kind of has fantasy managers worried about if he can stay healthy. Now, you already mentioned Carlos Hyde. He is now a Seattle Seahawk. He rushed for over 1,000 yards last season in 2019, meaning that he could cut into a healthy Chris Carson's production. So for me, I think he's going to have fewer points this upcoming season.
Ball security also an issue. 4 lost fumbles for Chris Carson last year, something to keep an eye on. All right, Adam Rank. Nick Chubb played half the year without Kareem Hunt. Will he score more or fewer than 255 points in PPR this year?
Oh, man, I hate to say fewer because I really love the talent of this running back. I think he is one of the best in the business, and I wish that he had the opportunity to have that backfield all to himself. So yeah, it's going to be fewer, unfortunately, because Kareem Hunt is there. And we have the evidence of what happened at the end of last season. Like once Kareem Hunt came in, his points fell dramatically.
Yeah, I got to worry about what's going to happen over the course of a full season.